Yesos Yahweh Ganarampwa. Yesos Ganarampwa. Hey hey oh. Yesos Ganarampwa. Hey hey oh.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the show, if you like the episode, if you like what you hear tonight, you know what to do. Hit that like button and the subscribe button. Hit that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people. Let's dig in. U.S. scholar Benjamin Keene acknowledges that historians accept uncritically a fatalistic epidemic plus lack of acquired immunity explanation for the shrinkage of Indian populations without sufficient attention to the socio-economic factors which predisposed the natives to succumb to even slight infections. Other scholars agree. Geographer William M. Denevan, while not ignoring the existence of widespread epidemic diseases, has emphasized the role of warfare, which reinforced the lethal impact of disease. There were military engagements directly between European and indigenous nations, but many more saw European powers pitting one indigenous nation against another, or factions within nations, with European allies aiding one or both sides, as was the case in the colonization of the peoples of Ireland, Africa, and Asia. Other killers cited by Denevan are overwork in mines, frequent outright butchery, malnutrition and starvation resulting from the breakdown of indigenous trade networks, subsistence food production and loss of land, loss of will to live or reproduce, and thus suicide, abortion, and infanticide, and deportation and enslavement. Anthropologist Henry Dobbins has pointed to the interruption of indigenous peoples' trade networks when colonizing powers seized indigenous trade routes. The ensuing acute shortages, including food products, weakened populations and forced them into dependency on the colonizers, with European manufactured goods replacing indigenous ones. Dobbins has estimated that all indigenous groups suffered serious food shortages 1 year in 4. In these circumstances, the introduction and promotion of alcohol proved addictive and deadly, adding to the breakdown of social order and responsibility. These realities render the myth of lack of immunity, including to alcohol, pernicious. Historian Woodrow Wilson Borah, B-O-R-A-H, focused on the broader arena of European colonization, which also brought depopulation in the Pacific Islands, Australia, Western Central America, and Western Africa. Sherburne Cook, associated with Borah in the revisionist Berkeley School, as it was called, studied the attempted destruction of the California Indians. Cook estimated 2,245 deaths among peoples in Northern California, the Wintu, Maidu, Miwok, Omo, Wapo, and Yokuts nations. In late 18th century, armed conflicts with the Spanish while some 5,000 died from disease and another 4,000 were relocated to missions. Among the same people in the second half of the 19th century, U.S. armed forces killed 4,000 and disease killed another 6,000. Between 1852 and 1867, U.S. citizens kidnapped 4,000 Indian children from these groups in California. Disruption of indigenous social structures under these conditions and dire economic necessity forced many of the women into prostitution in goldfield camps, further wrecking what vestiges of family life remained in these matriarchal societies. Proponents of the default position emphasize attrition by disease despite other causes equally deadly, if not more so. In doing so, they refuse to accept that the colonization of America was genocidal by plan, not simply the tragic fate of populations lacking immunity to disease. In the case of the Jewish Holocaust, no one denies that more Jews died of starvation, overwork, and disease under Nazi incarceration than died in gas ovens. Yet the acts of creating and maintaining the conditions that led to those deaths clearly constitute genocide. Anthropologist Michael V. Wilcox asks, what if archaeologists were asked to explain the continued presence of descendant communities 500 years after Columbus instead of their disappearance or marginality? Cox calls for the active dismantling of what he terms terminal narratives, accounts of Indian histories which explain the absence, cultural death, or disappearance of indigenous peoples. Gold fever. Searching for gold, Columbus reached many of the islands of the Caribbean and mapped them. Soon, a dozen other soldier merchants mapped the Atlantic coast from the northern Maritimes to the tip of South America. From the Iberian Peninsula came merchants, mercenaries, criminals, and peasants. They seized the land and property of indigenous populations and declared the territories to be extensions of the Spanish and Portuguese states. These acts were confirmed by the monarchies and endorsed by the papal authority of the Roman Catholic Church. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, with a line drawn from Greenland south through what is now Brazil. Called the Doctrine of Discovery, it claimed that possession of the entire world west of that line would be open to Spanish conquest and all east of it to Portuguese conquest. The story is well known, although not in as fine of detail as we covered in A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Check out that video. Never miss a chance for a shameless plug. The story is well known. In 1492, Columbus sailed with 3 ships on his first voyage at the behest of Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and Isabella, Queen of Castile. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469 had led to the merger of their kingdoms into what would become the core of the Spanish state. Columbus planted a colony of 40 of his men on Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic in Haiti, and returned to Spain with indigenous slaves and gold. In 1493, Columbus returned to the Caribbean with 17 ships, more than 1,000 men and supplies, he found that the men he had left on the first trip had subsequently been killed by the indigenous inhabitants. After planting another settlement, Columbus returned to Spain with 400 Arawak slaves. With 7 ships, Columbus returned to the Caribbean in 1498, reaching what is now Venezuela, and he made a 4th and final voyage in 1502, this time touching the Caribbean coast of Central America. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and charted the Pacific coast of the Americas. Juan Ponce de Leon claimed the Florida Peninsula for Spain in 1513. In 1521, following a 3-year bloodbath and overthrow of the Aztec state, Hernando Cortés proclaimed Mexico as New Spain. Parallel with the crushing of Mexican resistance were Ferdinand Magellan's explorations and charting of the Atlantic coast of the South American continent, followed by Spanish wars against the Inca nation of the Andes. In both Mexico and Peru, the conquistadors confiscated elaborate artwork and statuary made of gold and silver to be melted down for use as money. During that same period, the Portuguese laid waste to what is today Brazil and began a thriving slave trade that would funnel millions of enslaved Africans to South America, beginning the lucrative Atlantic slave trade. The consequences of this amassing of fortunes were first felt in the catastrophe experienced by small farmers in England and Europe. England and Europe. The peasants became impoverished. Dependent workers crowded into city slums. For the first time in human history, the majority of Europeans depended for their livelihood on a small, wealthy minority. For the first time in human history? Interesting. A phenomenon that capitalist-based colonialism would spread worldwide. The symbol of this new development, indeed its currency, was gold. Gold fever drove colonizing ventures, organized at first in pursuit of the metal in its raw form. Later, the pursuit of gold became more sophisticated, with planters and merchants establishing whatever conditions were necessary to hoard as much gold as possible. Thus was born an ideology, the belief in the inherent value of gold, despite its relative uselessness in reality. Investors, it's pretty funny when you think about it, isn't it? Investors, monarchies, and parliamentarians devised methods to control the processes of wealth accumulation and the power that came with it. But the ideology behind gold fever mobilized settlers to cross the Atlantic to an unknown fate, subjugating entire societies and civilizations, enslaving whole countries, and slaughtering people village by village. Did not seem too high a price to pay, nor did it appear inhumane. The systems of colonization were modern and rational, but its ideological basis was madness. And that is the end of chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Tune in to the next episode. In the meantime, hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.